are you? And where are you going? What do you want?
Hello and welcome to Jiggers' Place. I'm your host, Kevin Bemmel, and we're here every other Thursday to have a cocktail and talk about all the things in life except for business and professional and wealth building matters. So today, actually, I didn't realize, it didn't come into my head until this morning that today, or tonight actually, the Jewish holiday of Purim starts. This is my daughter's absolute favorite holiday because, among other things, you get to dress up in costumes. The day preceding the start of Purim, meaning now, today, is called the Feast of Esther. I mean, the Fast of Esther. I grew up all my young life thinking it was the Feast of Esther, but it was the Fast of Esther. And so from sunup today until sundown today, there's no eating or drinking. And here I have a show that features having a cocktail. So as it turns out, the cocktail that I designed with the help of ChatGPT for today's show is what's called a dry mix cocktail, meaning you mix all the ingredients together first, then you put the ice in and ice down the cocktail. So I'm going to do the first part since that's really the essence of making the cocktail. Since I can't try the cocktail, I'm not going to ice it down. It'll be a waste. I'm going to wait until after about 7:30 this evening, West Coast time, and then I'll be able to have my cocktail. For those of you who are on the East Coast, it's already after sundown, and so by all means, you can mix up the cocktail and enjoy it. And for those of you in Central Time, you're about most of the way there if you follow Jewish tradition. And of course, if you're not Jewish, you don't have to worry about this at all. So the cocktail that I designed is called the Civic Revival, and that's because today's show is about renewing societal institutions. So I'm not going to get into the details of it before I make the cocktail, but I think, as I've been mentioning, promoting the show all week, trust in societal institutions, all-time lows in most cases. And this is, I think, not a good thing for our society. And so what are we going to do about it? So in honor of this topic, as I said, with the help of ChatGPT, I designed the Civic Revival cocktail. You'll also notice that I'm dressed very institutional, very preppy, right? Is there anything more institutional than preppy? Now, when I went to college, starting in 1978, I went to USC, University of Southern California, very preppy school. And among other things, we wore Oxford button-down collar shirts. I did not have a rep tie, or for that matter, a rep bow tie back then, but Ivy Leaguers, rep ties are the rage. I have my rowing blazers, wool slacks with the herringbone pattern, and I can't get my foot up high enough. You can only see the bottom. I have my Basswegian penny loafers on. So, here we go. That's again, we're going with the theme here. Not unlike, I think it was 2 weeks or 4 weeks ago when I talked about Peter Mayle and I had my, scarf on like a good Frenchman. So, okay. So today's cocktail is a gin-based cocktail. And I would argue that gin is the, most institutional excuse me, of the spirits, partly because it's so classically British. And so this cocktail calls for a London dry gin. I'm going to use Boodles, which is a classic London dry gin. It's been around since 1845, so 180 years, right? And it's just the great expression of a London dry gin. There's many. There's Booker's, there's Tanqueray, Sapphires, the regular Sapphire, and they're all wonderful. The next ingredient is Drambuie. So Drambuie has been around for 280 years, since 1745. It is a malt whiskey, i.e. Scotch whiskey based liqueur that has honey and other spices in it. The recipe is kept secret, but not so secret that the London-based inn isn't allowed to know about it, and so can certify Drambuie as being kosher. And then the next ingredient is lemon juice. You can certainly use fresh lemon juice. I have this great Italia Garden pre-squeezed lemon juice. And then last is bitters, and I'm using Orchard Street bitters. Now, Orchard Street is a famous part of the Lower East Side in Manhattan, where a lot of immigrants from Europe, including Jewish immigrants, came. It's not institutional in the sense that gin and the Ivy League are, but it's institutional in the sense that it's a place where people new to this country went, congregated, and figured out what was life in the United States all about. And so, it's got it combines celery, apples, and vinegar, all sort of kind of old world taste. So I thought that would be a good little accent for this cocktail. But you can certainly, by the way, you can use Angostura bitters, just straight Angostura. You can also use Unterberg. These are the two most common bitters that you'll find. Of course, there are lots more. I have the entire Bitterman's collection because, among other things, it's certified kosher. They have just all these great different ones, and so they're a lot of fun to play with. Okay, so we're going to start out with 2 ounces of gin. Let me find let's see. Yep, there it is. Yeah, I think so. Okay, so 2 ounces of gin and an ounce of Drambuie. Okay, so Drambuie is kind of sweet because of the honey. I'm having trouble reading this. Okay, there it is. And if you can't see it because it's in a dark bottle and thing, but it has kind of a pale yellow color. Not unlike honey. It also has a very nice aroma. Yeah, there's just, it really is one of my favorite liquor, as you can tell, because, this bottle is mostly empty at this point. Okay, and then 3/4 of an ounce of lemon juice. Okay. And then a couple of dashes of the Bitterman's. 1, 2. The Bitterman's Orchard Street bitters. Okay, and then we're going to cover this. And we're going to shake it until it smooths out. Doesn't take a lot, but oops. Uh-oh, my shaker is it's leaking. Okay, so you shake it until it's smoothed out. Now, if you're going to drink the cocktail, you want to next put ice into the shaker. Shake it down for about 20, 25 seconds, 30 seconds to chill it down. Give a chance for some of the ice to melt, as we talk about, and bring out the flavors. And then to drink it, you'll strain it into a coupe glass. This is a coupe glass. It's got the kind of rounded shape, okay? And you can garnish it with a little piece of lemon peel. You can twist the lemon over it to get a little bit of the lemon oil that's in the peel over your cocktail. And then you can either just discard that lemon peel, you can drop it in the drink. I like dropping it in the drink because it just adds a little bit to it, and you'll be ready to go. Okay, so now I'm gonna meet you over the cocktail, but I am gonna take 30 seconds to clean my hands first. So here we are. It's heading toward the end of the week. It's time to relax, and normally, of course, I'd be enjoying my cocktail. I have to wait a little bit longer to do that. It's this is the first week of daylight savings time, so it's much lighter right now than it normally is when we meet. It's more like 4 o'clock in the afternoon than 5. So it may seem a little bit early for a cocktail, but after the sun crosses over the yardarm, that's how it used to be in the Navy, and so you can certainly enjoy. And of course, everywhere else in the country, it's later than here, so you're closer to it being dark. So our topic for today is renewing societal institutions, and there are lots of societal institutions. So we can talk about government, whether it's local, state, federal government. And there's aspects of it. There are institutions like libraries, which you might say, well, they're part of government. Okay, schools, which are a part of government, but kind of separate from it as well. And then there are institutions that are not necessarily, or that are not connected with government. For example, there are religious institutions. There are what used to be known as social clubs or fraternal societies. There are organizations like, there are veterans organizations like the Veterans of Foreign Wars and the American Legion. So all of these institutions have seen a decline in public esteem, if you will, over the last at least 20 years, and in most cases longer than that. Now, some of them were coming up from decline, peaked, and have gone down again. So I'm not going to track every single one. The two that I'm going to focus on are the two that I've had the most involvement with and know the most about. And that is the military and religious institutions. So I was a Navy chaplain. So my involvement with those two societal institutions are obvious. Now, that's not to say that others are not as important or not as crucial to society. They certainly are, and maybe on a future show we'll talk about those. But the two I'm going to talk about again are the military and religious institutions. So I was doing a little bit of research in preparation for the show. So according to the data that I found, in 1999, 70% of Americans were in some way or another associated with a religious institution. As of 2020, so about 21 years later, that had dropped to 47%.
So that's a drop of over 40%, okay, in about 20 years. The military in 2018, 70% of Americans had a positive view of the military. By last year, 2024, that had dropped to 50%. So that's a drop of 30%. Okay, and you know, when I was in the military, I started in 2006. It had largely recovered from the huge negative sort of view of the public moving through the latter part and end of the Vietnam War. So, as you might imagine, during World War II, public approval of military very high. Even through Korea, it was very high. At the beginning of the Vietnam War, it was very high then as well. But as the Vietnam War dragged on and Americans didn't see the point of the war, so faith in the military started to drop. And it wasn't until around the time of the first Gulf War where you know, the United States had such a quick and complete victory, and then into the early days of the war on terrorism, that we saw, you know, a return to pretty much, I don't want to say literally universal, but very high public approval of the military. And throughout my active duty career, from the mid to the end of the 2000s, it was very high, and it continued that way until about, you know, 5-6 years ago, when it started to decline. So I think it's worth looking, first of all, at what caused some of the declines. And I think for one of the reasons why I want to talk about both the military and religious institutions is I think that there are similarities to the reasons why people lost faith in these institutions. So I'm going to talk about, I think, 3 thoughts I have on that score. So I think the number one is people lost faith in what these institutions were doing because they swerved away from their core mission, right? So the core mission of religious institutions is to provide guardrails for behavior in our society and to help people learn about and understand their values, and especially their values as reflected against the values of society. So as religious institutions more and more took on the attitude of, well, if you think it's right, then it's okay, this idea of people seeing their values reflected against what were, up until that time, well established and age old. And when I say age old, we're talking centuries, if not millennia, values. Religious institutions became less meaningful in people's lives. So if I'm my own decisor of what's right or wrong, so then what do I need a church or a synagogue for? That's not relevant. I'm what's relevant. So I think that's religious institutions and by the way, I think all of the things I'm going to talk about are somewhat connected, but I think religious institutions started to lose their focus on what they're really here to do in society. The United States military, as well, I think, because of what were essentially, I wouldn't call the Korean War a military loss, but we basically fought. We, meaning the United States, along with South Korea and the UN alliance, essentially fought North Korea and China, and to a lesser extent Russia, to a standstill. There wasn't really a victory in the Korean War. And then follow that into the Vietnam War, where it was a loss. There's no other way to categorize what happened in Vietnam. The United States ended up withdrawing somewhat ignobly, if you remember. I was a child at the time, 11, I believe, when the images of the fall of Saigon and the overtaking of the U.S. embassy in Saigon and the helicoptering off of the last few people, and it was horrendous to watch. So the sense that America was no longer a victorious military power, I think, created in a lot of Americans this idea of, well, the military has lost its way, and it can't fulfill its primary function. And as a result, people stopped supporting it. Okay. Now, there was a lot of talk about, the baby killers and all that kind of stuff. While almost all of that turned out to be false or very, relegated to very small groups of people, that certainly had some impact. But I don't think for most Americans, the so-called My Lai massacre and these kind of things, I don't think those particularly attributed to the larger loss of public respect for the military. I think it was a broader malaise that people perceived in a military. And remember that most people who were adults and even teenagers at the time that of the Vietnam War, they were maybe they were probably teenagers and young adults coming out of World War II. World War II, which may count as the greatest military victory of all time, certainly of modern times. There's nothing on the scale of World War II in terms of victory. Not even World War I really comes close. And so the idea that the United States, that had been so massively victorious in World War II, basically fought China, and which was one of the allies in World War II, by the way, and North Korea could only fight them to a standstill, didn't have the guts to do what needed to be done, was disappointing. And then add on to that the United States basically got, for all intents and purposes, thrown out of Vietnam, really disheartened a lot of Americans. And so those things really, people felt that the military had lost its way. So I think that's one factor. The second factor is, I think there was a loss of ability is the wrong term. The loss of leadership in both these institutions to really articulate what is the mission of these institutions, and how am I, as a leader in this one of these institutions, going to bring that mission about. So as the mission of these of these institutions became cloudy, leadership sort of bought into the cloudiness, and they sort of brought their own opinions to it rather than leading based on the mission of these institutions. So religious leaders became involved in a lot of things that did not contribute to what, well, either did not contribute to what religion had historically been about, or they got involved in things that historically had caused people to turn their nose up at religion. So I don't want to say that that there's never been times in human history when people had a negative view of religion. There were times. So at one point, for example, the papacy located itself in essentially the south of France, and there was just debauchery going on. Now, the average person didn't know about that because we didn't have the kind of mass communication at that time that we have today. But certainly people in powerful positions, the aristocracy throughout Europe, much of it knew what was going on. And there were many who turned away from, I don't want to say turned away from the church per se, but they it caused, crisis is too strong a word. It caused a revulsion for the way religious leaders were leading the church. In this case, I mean the Roman Catholic Church. And I don't mean to pick on the Roman Catholic Church. Every religion has had these kind of problems. I just use that as a striking example. So leadership really lost its way, and that was true in the 70s and on into the 80s. Military leadership lost its way. We had General Westmoreland apologizing for what happened in Vietnam. Now you could say, well, that's an amazingly humble thing to do. Yes, but the fact that he had to apologize instead of having done his job in Vietnam shows you that leadership had lost its way. And the same thing happened in religious institutions. We started within churches and synagogues, the abuse of children, abuse of women, and instead of dealing with these problems forthrightly, there were attempts to cover them up. All of this meant that leadership had lost its way and was no longer pursuing the mission of these organizations, and thereby further eroding public confidence. And then finally, the third aspect is both institutions got involved in politics, partisan politics to be specific, in ways that I think caused, in the case of religious institutions, schisms, or people to just abandon them altogether. And in the military, also caused people who, for example, traditionally wanted to be involved in the military, they didn't want to be involved in the military anymore because of how much political stuff was going on, and again caused people to lose faith in the military. So I'm going to talk about the military first in this case. I joined the military in 2006. In my early days as a chaplain in the military, when someone, especially an officer, wanted to say something political, what they would do is they would ask me to come in their office and close the door, and they would talk to me one-on-one about their consternation over a political situation. I remember one situation in particular. I was visiting a dental clinic when I was stationed in Okinawa. The director of that dental clinic was a young female officer. I think she was a lieutenant commander, if memory serves. She was a very good clinic director, and I was passing by her office during this one particular visit, and she saw me and she said, "Chaplain, I'd like to speak to you for a minute." So I walked back to her door. I said, "Yes, ma'am. What can I do for you?" And she said, "Would you come in and close the door?" Which to me always meant, uh-oh, I'm in trouble. No, not at all. So I went in, closed the door. She said, "Please have a seat." So I sat down, and she just let loose about what was going on politically in the United States. And I'm not going to talk about what she said. It's not relevant to the show. Contrast that with about 10 years later. And at the time, I was the command chaplain for SEAL Team 17. And in a staff meeting with about 30 or 40 people there, the commanding officer for SEAL Team 17 just cut loose on some very political remarks. Very surprised. Now, the fact of the matter is, I suspect 80% or more of people in that room agreed with him. But 10 years before, I don't think he would have done it in that way. It wasn't public in the sense that this was a staff meeting, but I don't think a commanding officer would have made those remarks in front of a whole group of service members. It just wouldn't have happened. So the climate of how politics was dealt with in the military had changed considerably over the 10 and what came to be 16 years I spent in the military. The same thing is true in churches and synagogues. So again, I'll talk about my personal experience, although I know many people who have had the same experience. So I grew up in the Reformed Jewish movement. The Reformed Jewish movement was always more concerned with politics than the other movements, but whatever. But by the time I was in my early 30s, politics was actively being preached from the pulpit, from what's called the bema in a synagogue, and very partisan politics. And the undertone was, if you don't believe these positions, you are not and cannot be a good Jew. Now, it was never that way when I was a child and a young man. Rabbis just never would have said such things. They understood their congregants held various political views, and the idea that there was only one set of political perspectives that could make you a good Jew, they would never say something like that because it's not true. Okay, and this continued on. And I know I eventually left the Reform movement because of that. I became what's called a Baal Tshuva. I went to traditional Judaism. But even within traditional Judaism, as much as the synagogue I attended for many years attempted to not get involved in partisan politics, it did. And I can tell you, as a congregant, in those cases, I went to the rabbi and I said, this is not acceptable. And by the way, I would say in 2 out of the 3 cases, I agreed with what he was saying. But in all 3 cases, I said, this is not what we're here for. We are not here to do partisan politics. And the idea that you, as the rabbi of this congregation, should be opining on how people should vote or what they should believe politically about policies in the United States is not satisfactory, right? And I know many people in that synagogue were offended, and yet, it would happen again. And I think this is a big mistake. A religious congregation is a place where we can come together and understand our core values. Now, would that our politics absolutely be an expression of our core values? Then perhaps it wouldn't be a problem. But the fact of the matter is, political positions aren't necessarily tied to our core values. And I think part of the problem is today that a lot of us don't understand our core values because we're not involved with an institution that helps us get clear on them. So we adopt we adopt the values that are popular in society, or the society or the community in which we live, and or diametrically reject those values rather than exploring values internally and coming to conclusions about what our core values are. And that is the purpose, as I said in the beginning, of religious institutions. Now, when I say religious institutions, I don't mean just churches and synagogues and mosques for that matter, but also, for example, in the Jewish community, here in LA, we have a huge number of Jewish communal services. And as far as I understand it, so do many Christian and Islamic denominations. So I include those institutions because I can say categorically here in Los Angeles, the communal institutions too got very bogged down in politics in a very negative way. And many people who didn't share those politics abandoned those institutions as a result. And so the Los Angeles Jewish Federation, for example, which prided itself on being the central address for all Jews in Los Angeles, I think it still claims that it is not a correct claim. It's the central address now for Jewish organizations that want monetary funding, and a lot of them will sort of hold their nose if they don't agree with the politics being espoused by the Federation. But they don't. The Jewish Federation can no longer claim that it is a place where any Jew can come and feel comfortable. And that's largely due to partisan politics infecting these organizations. Now, I want to be clear about one thing. I do not believe that religious people should not be involved in politics. I absolutely, religious people should be involved in politics, but that involvement should take place outside of religious institutions. Okay? So within those religious institutions, politics should have no part. Outside of those institutions, by all means, religious people need to be involved in how our country is governed. And so that's the distinction that I would make. So now getting to, sort of the core topic for today's show, how do we then renew these societal institutions? Right? I don't think it's coincidental that young people today suffer in much higher percentages from depression, anxiety, a sense of not having a place in society. All of these things, I think, stem in part from an alienation from, number one, religious institutions, and number two, societal institutions in general. And the military always being one that had a very strong influence on Americans and on a sense of patriotism and love for the United States. And by the way, I don't mean to say that Americans love war. I don't think we do love war. I don't think we love combat. What we love is a sense that if we have to fight, we will fight to win, and we will do so in a way that reflects well on our country. That's how Americans have, I think, historically perceived the American military, even when there have been lapses in that. And there have been lapses. There have been lapses in all wars, but it wasn't institutional to the military, or thought to be institutional to the military, until perhaps the Korean War and then into the Vietnam War era. So I think, number one, these institutions need to recommit themselves to their core missions. Okay? And there's two primary ways that will be brought. Well, there's three primary ways that will be brought about. One is, we as people who are involved in these institutions, or who have been alienated from them but recognize the importance of being involved in these institutions, need to demand, quietly but firmly, that these institutions rededicate themselves to their core missions. In the case of the military, it is being the force that defends America and works with her allies throughout the world to support American interests. No politics, no nothing. This is what the military does. So we need to demand that of the military and of religious institutions. We need to demand that they go back to their job of bringing moral clarity to society. Okay. Now, I want to digress on this subject for just a moment. It is not unusual for younger people to reject the values of their parents. That is part of, it seems, the maturation process here in the United States. And so I think it's a mistake for religious institutions to water down their values in an attempt to hold on to more young people. And that's because if those young people leave, and they tend to leave anyway because that's the rebellious thing to do, when they get older and start to better understand the importance of values in our lives, there's nothing to go back to, because now these institutions have been watered down. As well, what young people, children and young people, have to do in order to rebel against an institution that doesn't hold to its traditional values becomes so perverse. It leads to the kind of despondency, depression, anxiety that we see so much more frequently in society today. Okay? So it's not a bad thing per se that young people test the values of their parents. They're going to do that. We as adults and parents need to stand firm and have confidence that our values actually serve society well and in the long term. And as children grow up and mature, most will figure that out. The problem is when we water down values, there is nothing compelling children, young people, to go through that maturation process, and they remain adolescents for life. And we see that in our society now, where we see 60-year-olds who are still adolescents, right? So as a society, and in particular as religious institutions, we need to have the courage of our convictions. And when people stray from our values, we need to lovingly, I would argue, continue to approach them, welcome them, but not coddle them and not give up our values in a vain attempt to coax them back because we're not going to be judgmental. The way to be non-judgmental is to, just not judge people, but that doesn't mean that we give up our values. So if I say, I don't believe in property destruction as a form of protest. Now you say, well, that's a political value, but that stems from a core value. To destroy in the name of getting my way is immature. Okay. And so I do not support destruction as a way to get my way. Okay. I believe that people need to act in a mature manner. Okay. So that doesn't mean that I have to go around and condemn individuals who violate that value. I can just express what my value is. And if people differ from that, well, then they do, but they know where I stand. Okay. Now, if they claim that I'm judging them by making a statement that I believe it's wrong to destroy property in order to get my way, just like I believe it's wrong to water down values in order to keep people affiliated with a religious institution, they can say, well, you're being judgmental. No, I'm not. I'm stating my belief. If my belief differs from yours, well, okay. By that standard, you're being judgmental of me as well. But you can state your value. I can state mine. Neither one of those are judgmental. It only crosses over into being judgmental when I say to you, and you are bad for holding a different belief. Okay. Now, it is implied that I believe that holding a different belief than mine is wrong. That is implied. But implication is not judgmental. Implication is implication. Okay. So we as people who are either alienated and or want to re-engage with these institutions, we need to quietly but firmly insist they go back to their core functions. That's number one. Number two, leadership needs to lead in accordance with those core functions. Okay, they should not equivocate. They should not get involved in tangential matters. They need to focus on meeting the mission. So, flag officers and general officers in the military should concentrate on one thing and one thing only: creating as lethal a military force as possible that is available to civilian authority to support America's defense objectives. Period. End of story. That's what leadership in the military should be concerned with. Okay? Leadership of religious institutions should be concerned with one thing and one thing only, and that is representing by how they behave, how they speak, the core tenets of faith of the religion that they represent. Period. Without equivocation and without distraction. Now, again, that doesn't mean being judgmental, okay? But it does mean saying, this is what we stand for as a congregation, as a religious denomination, as a community. Now, religious leaders can go on and say, and we are human beings. And at times, maybe frequently, we're going to fall short of these values. And so the task is for us to support each other in rededicating to holding to these values ever more closely. That is the only thing religious leaders should be doing. They need to live it. They need to speak it. And finally, partisan politics should be rendered no place at all in these institutions. If a congregant or a volunteer in a religious institution wants to bring partisan politics into the institution, they should be told politely but firmly, that is not a part of what we do here. All it does is create divisions among us as a community. And so while I encourage you to be involved in politics, you need to do it outside of our church, synagogue, mosque, communal organization. And in the military, commissioned officers need to go back to a policy of strict disinvolvement in anything political, both publicly and in military circles. Now, that is actually what's required by the UCMJ, the Uniform Code of Military Justice. So, for example, I was at an event early in my Navy career, and it was attended by, I believe it was a city council member for a city in Florida. And this was an event put on by my chaplain endorser. It was a military event, essentially. And he showed up. He was a reservist. He showed up in his uniform. And we were talking. I said, "So what do you do?" He says, "Oh, I'm a council member for the city of whatever it was." And he said, "But we're not here to talk about what I do, because I'm here in uniform. And as an officer in, I think he was in the U.S. Army, I may be wrong, it is not appropriate for me to engage in anything that even remotely looks like politics." Now, that meeting, by the way, took place in 2008, right? So, 10 years later, I'm not saying he would have changed, but the attitude had changed. Officers would openly take political positions, and that is wrong. Okay? If an officer of the United States military wants to openly take a political position, he needs to resign his commission. Okay, I feel strongly about this. If he's collecting a military pension, he should renounce his pension, and then go do all the politicking you want. But otherwise, keep your mouth closed. Now, in the privacy of your home, private events with a few friends, of course, there's no problem with officers talking about politics, exchanging views. But in any situation that's of a military setting or a public setting, no politics. And in decision making, and in the setting and enacting of policy, no politics at all. Politics are for civilians. Uniformed people are there to execute. Now, it's a little bit different for enlisted people, because they're not treated as strictly about political matters as commissioned officers are. But I think it would be a wise policy for the military to restrict enlisted people as much as officers are restricted in terms of how politics plays into the United States military. Because the reality is, one of the reasons why recruiting in the military has been so tough the last several years is because people who would traditionally join the military felt that the military was espousing values antithetical to political ideas, antithetical to their own. Okay. Now, this did start, by the way, while I was in the military. So when I was in the military, the lifting of the "don't ask, don't tell" policy for gays was that happened, and the military made a very strange decision about how they were going to enact that policy. So they said chaplains who disagreed with that policy could resign, but no other officers could. Now, in my opinion, that's wrong. If you're going to insert what was a political issue into the military, because the prior policy was "don't ask, don't tell," It was just, you're in the military. We don't care what you're doing in your private life. Fine. Okay. The policy was changed, and that was a political policy that was changed. People should have been given the ability to leave the military if they disagreed with it. That would be the proper thing to do. But that was where a lot of the distaste for politics in the military started to enter into things. Okay. And then it kind of grew after that. So number one, we as people who need these institutions, we need to insist that they go back to their core missions. Anything outside of those core missions needs to go. Number two, leaders in these institutions, they need to rededicate themselves to pursuing the core missions of these organizations. And number three, politics should be rendered verboten, as the Germans would say. Partisan politics within the institutions, leave them outside. So that's those are my ideas on renewing societal institutions. And, obviously these ideas will not work for government, because government is inherently political. So, restoring trust in government, I think it would have to be, broadly in government, I think that, there would have to be other ideas. And so that's a topic for another day, as I mentioned at the beginning. So I encourage you to think about these things. If you're like me, I'm a military veteran. I really am sad over the direction I saw the military take during my career. That has gotten exacerbated since then. I used to be very involved in religious communal life and synagogue life. I'm completely estranged from it now, frankly. It's not a good thing for me. I hope this doesn't sound egotistical. I don't think it's a good thing for these institutions either, because I think I brought a lot to them. My estrangement comes from the kinds of issues that I've just been voicing. And part of my impetus, part of my reason for doing this show is for me to figure out, how can I re-engage with these institutions in a positive way? And this is, the beginning of me trying to figure that out. So I welcome your thoughts on these subjects. All the links to our social media will be in the show notes after this episode posts. And I hope that if, like me, you feel alienated from societal institutions, especially religious institutions and the military, that this show will be an impetus for you to think a second time and join with me in figuring out, how can we in good conscience re-engage with these institutions for our own benefit, but also for the benefit of American society at large. So I thank you very, very much for joining me on this show. If you were able to make a cocktail, I hope you enjoyed it, and wish you a wonderful evening. For those my fellow Jews who are watching, a happy Purim and a wonderful rest of the week and weekend. And we'll re-engage on business matters starting on Monday at 10 a.m. next week. Signing off as I always do, and always were an inspiration to me, and I think about you every day, Marie, my dear friend up in heaven now. You are my bell, you really are, especially on a journey like this. Courage at all times, my friends.